All right, welcome back. First, some TMI, too much information. I woke up with a cough this morning. I have no idea where it came from. I hope I'm not coming down with anything. But this is the fifth time through this lecture. And the other previous four tries, I broke into a coughing fit. And I can't do it anymore. I gotta push through. This is my way of saying that if you hear me clear my throat or sip a little bit of my soda, I'm sorry. I'll try to edit out the big coughing fits, but I just got to push through this because I got other lectures I got to record. You can hear my voice going. By the end of this, I'm going to sound like either Bill Clinton or Grunkle Stan off of Gravity Falls. But okay, so enough TMI. Let's get to arts of Sub-Saharan Africa. Africa, it's big. I've told this 5 times now, but let's do it one more time. I think the biggest thing that people get wrong about Africa is they don't realize just how big it is. If you look at a map, standard Mercator projection, North America looks just as big as Africa. It's all lies because, of course, things in the Northern Hemisphere are distorted on a map projection. If you took the lower 48 United States, the continental United States, you could put that amount of space, real estate, 4 times inside the continent of Africa. That's how big Africa is. Africa holds a multitude of cultures, religions, and of course, art. So let's get to this. When we talk about African art, the first thing we do is we cut off the top third of Africa. Why? Why do we slice off Africa's hat? The reason we slice off Africa's hat is because Africa's hat, North Africa, borders along the Mediterranean. And there's a lot of other influence from other cultures there. So this part of the world had been controlled by Phoenicians, Romans, Byzantines, and eventually Muslims. And it's predominantly Muslim today. So for that reason, when we talk about African art, we're generally talking about Sub-Saharan African art. So you have the vast Sahara Desert, and at the edge of that, you have the Sahel. The Sahel is this semi-arid region, and everything below that is what we usually mean when we call African art. And it kind of makes sense. It's a little bit arbitrary, but it does make sense because we have different cultures, different ethnicities, different languages, and different artistic styles on either side of this border of the Sahel. So we will talk about North Africa, but we will save that for when we talk about Islamic art. Now, that doesn't mean by any by any way that these two cultures are completely separate, because there are caravan routes all over the Sahara Desert. There is the Nile River, which is a major trade route down, and you will see cross-pollination between North African cultures and Sub-Saharan African cultures. But generally, just for the purposes of organization, we consider them separately. So let's talk about the major regions of art and how they're a little bit different. We're going to talk about West African art. That's, of course, the West Coasts. We're going to talk about Central Africa as the central rainforest regions. There's the Horn of Africa, which is going to be the savanna and the veldt out to the Indian Ocean. And then, of course, there's Southern Africa. I think one of the other important things to remember is that the oldest art in the world is in Africa. Some of the oldest art objects are in Africa. Africa is where the human race began, in the rift valleys of East Africa. And so we have lots and lots of art. The Sahara Desert is a desert now, but 10,000 years ago, it was a lush plain, a verdant veldt that had rhinoceros and hippopotamus and lions and, obviously, as you can tell by this picture, giraffe. Now, there are no giraffe in, northern Nigeria today, but at the time, there were lots. And so as the Sahara Desert dried out, these cultures moved to the perennial water sources and moved either south or north. And so they are ultimately connected. Some of the earliest evidence we have for animal domestication, cattle domestication, the creation of the bow, of boats, we're going to find on wall paintings and rock paintings in Algeria. And we can tell by these paintings that these cultures are the cultures that we associate with Sub-Saharan Africa. They have evidence of ritual scarification, headdresses, and of course, the darker skin color, which indicates these people were Africans. So some of the earliest art is being produced in the world by Africans. Let's talk about West Africa. So West Africa is, of course, the regions we call the Gold and the Ivory Coast. They're called that because that's what their main trade Items were gold and ivory, which they had in abundance, which meant that they were extraordinarily wealthy. The other big thing they traded in was salt. And so those three raw commodities made these some of the wealthiest kingdoms in the world. In fact, the wealthiest kingdom in the world, Mali, which was wealthier than any other nation in the history of the earth, was in West Africa. So the region is defined by the Niger River. So the Niger River starts in the west and it flows inland, north, until it gets to the inner delta. The inner delta is a place where the water slows down, it spreads out into a vast kind of swampy marsh. It's a very fertile location. And right at that northern point, which is right here, we have the major city of Timbuktu. Now, Timbuktu, we use Timbuktu to say someplace that's really remote, but once upon a time, Timbuktu was the major trading and cultural hub, and that would grant them access to the trading routes that went north across the Sahara Desert. From there, the Niger River turns south and eventually empties out in what is modern-day Nigeria, but it's this river that defines these empires. And the great empires of the region were all kind of within that boundary. Religion, in terms of culture, to the north it's going to be Islamic, and to the south it's going to be more animistic and tribal. There's that throat coming up again. So in West Sahara we have these huge, very powerful empires that are ruled by very strong divine kings. There's a number of these: Ghana, Mali, Ashanti, Ife, Benin. A little word about geography in West Africa, as it sometimes can be confusing. When these countries gained their independence after the colonial period, they named their countries after these ancient empires because they were very powerful and very evocative. But this causes confusion in terms of culture and geography. For example, when the Ashanti kingdom gained its independence, they decided to name themselves Ghana after an ancient empire that was, again, centered in this region here. So anciently, Ghana was up here, but this is where modern Ghana is today. Culturally, ethnically, historically, these two cultures have nothing to do with each other. They're completely separate. But hey, New York City really doesn't have anything to do with York in England, so we change names. You have New South Wales in Australia, which doesn't look anything like Wales in the British Isles, so maybe you can forgive them that. The same thing is true of Benin. The modern country Benin is named for the Benin Empire, but it's geographically and ethnically and culturally it has nothing to do with the Benin Empire. The Benin Empire was actually in modern-day Nigeria. So there we go. So let's talk about these West African cultures. These was a series of empires and kingdoms that thrived between the 11th and the 19th century, right up until the colonial period. And they're going to be tribal kingdoms ruled by a divine chieftain. There is this strong belief in divine chieftain and chiefdoms in West Africa. You have a king who is believed to have been descended from the gods and who is believed to rule by divine right. There are many different names for these divine chieftains. The Yoruba there's the Oni. In the Benin Empire, they called it the Oba. And there still is an Oni and an Oba today in those countries. So there's an unbroken chain of these kind of divine kingdoms. And we also have a strong ancestral cult. Worship of ancestors was a very common feature. Your ancestors would die, you would venerate your ancestors, and they would believe to grant favors to you in this life. Religion tended to be shamanistic and animistic. Animistic is this belief that everything in the universe has some kind of god or spirit that attends to it, and you needed a shaman to divine the will of the spirits in order to have a good harvest, success in battle, success in life, all of these things. So you have a number of these sacred societies. These are societies where a person was trained to be a shaman, to speak to the spirits, and then would also take care of the daily ritual. And so masks and ritual performance, taking on the identity of the gods and the spirits, this is a very important feature of West African society, and the masks become a very important feature of their art, as does performance. Now, all of these cultures, until the arrival of either Islamic or Western cultures, did not have writing. But that doesn't mean that they didn't have histories. They actually did. But they didn't write them down. Instead, they kept their histories through oral historians, and there was a variety of these. In the Mali Empire, the griots were the people who kept the stories, and in the Ashanti culture, you have these people called staff speakers. They actually have literal staffs that indicate them. And these were high-ranking functionaries in the court of these cultures, and they remembered things through poetry and song. And the more we look at this, the more we realize how accurate these histories are. Some of these cultures we only know through archaeology. Others, we do have this kind of oral tradition and can recreate it. So let's start at some of the earliest. One of the earliest is the Djenne culture. The Djenne culture was found at Djeno, which just is the site, which means old Djenne. And it is located right on that inner Niger Delta, which makes sense. It's a very fertile, isolated area. It's connected to major trade routes. And between the 5th and the 15th century, there was a real flourishing of culture there. Not much is left behind. In fact, the only art tradition we have are these beautiful terracotta figures. The terracotta figures show figures that are kneeling or crouching, and they have a beautiful sensitivity to them, wonderful curvilinear forms. This one is really beautiful. I love how he lays his head on his knee in this kind of very naturalistic pose. So there's a mix of stylization and abstraction and naturalism there. As what these figures are, we don't know. Our best guess, they seem to have been buried intentionally, which means they're probably votive objects. They're probably representations of ancestors or the deceased. One of the characteristics they have is they have all these little nodules on them, and these are probably meant to represent ritual scarification. Ritual scarification is a big deal in West African cultures, and it happens in two principal ways. The first way is a coming-of-age ceremony. If you are a young man, a young woman, you reach the age of 14, 15, you need to be initiated into the society of adults, and so you would go through a ritual scarification. Your body would be scarred, and this would be the mark that you would become an adult. And this isn't just any kind of, I was going to say emo cutting, but that's a little insensitive. Cutting's a serious problem. I shouldn't be making jokes about that. Bad professor. No, this isn't just random cutting. It's a very serious thing you have to do. You have to actually cut the skin, and then you have to cross-hatch the skin to create the area where the scar is going to create, and then you rub dirt or clay into it to prevent it from closing so that you know that it will develop this ridge or this prominence. So it's not an easy thing. It's not a one-time ordeal. It's something that would continue over your life. When we see figures that are as heavily scarified as this, that's an indication that this isn't just a rite of passage, that this is an elite. Elites would undergo this extreme form of body modification. And why? Because they stand out. Same reason you get a big tattoo or a big piercing today. You want people to recognize you. You want people to, you're communicating your identity. So if you have scars all over your body like this, and you walk into a village, instantaneously people know you're a big deal. You're a noble of some kind, because only nobles had the ability to have somebody who had the training to go through this. So undoubtedly it was very painful, but again, it gives you status. It, creates this kind of status. The next culture that we encounter is the Noc culture. The Noc culture is, again, another one of these cultures in Nigeria. This one is to the south, though. This one's in the Sahel, so it's not up in that inner delta right on the borders of the Sahara Desert. And the Noc are noted for these incredibly beautiful, stylized heads. Beautiful heads. Now, these tend to be less naturalistic than the Djenne figures and tend to be more stylized, more abstract, very abstract eyes, but still clearly African cultures. We see beautiful beaded collars. We also see elaborate hairstyles, headdresses, braided and beaded hair as well. Now, why these figures look like this? Well, it's clear that these aren't portraits, that they're probably meant to represent types, ancestors, gods, deities, rulers, those kind of things. The reason that the heads are enlarged is probably because in many West African cultures, the head is the source of power. It is where your juju, your mana, your energy comes from. And so therefore, this is a representation of power, your soul, and so your head is going to be larger. But looking at these with their elaborate jewelry, bracelets, collars, and elaborate, beautiful hairstyles. These are obviously high-status individuals. This one was probably holding a spear, represents a warrior or a ruler. There is some evidence that these were painted and covered in a very thin slip that has since fallen off. So now they're just these beautiful terracotta heads. I love how precise some of the angles are. They really appeal to a modernist sense of design. Well, that brings us to the Yoruba culture, and unlike the Jene and the Noc, which we only know from archaeology, the Yoruba culture have a very rich oral history, and they have a tradition of kings going all the way back to the 11th century. They are also located in what is modern-day Nigeria. At the center of their culture was Ife. Ife is located right here. And Ife, according to Yoruba culture, is the center of the universe. They have a pantheon of gods. The chief god, Olodumare, is the supreme god, and he orders one of his sons, Obatala, to create the earth. But he gets drunk on the way. He finds some palm wine and slacks off. And so then it falls to Oduduwa, and I hope I'm saying that correctly, he is the one that takes up creation, and he draws a chain down from heaven down to the primordial waters and draws up the earth. And so literally they believe that Ife is the center of the universe and is chained to heaven. Ife is called the city of 401 Orisha, or spirits, and 401 is a very significant number in their belief system. So it's a religious center, and it is a religious center to this day. There is still an Oni, a kind of divine spiritual chieftain or leader that is still there. And they again have this animistic ancestral religion, this belief that all life is kind of animated, and they pass this on through their oral tradition. They have a very vibrant carving style that again is highly stylized, and this carving style continues right up until the 20th century. When we look at Yoruba figures, they're noted for their incredible sense of design. They are traditionally carved in wood. They often have a high degree of polish. They take these natural tropical hardwoods and polish them to an incredible degree. So we have stylized faces, the heads are enlarged, the bodies are likewise stylized. This is by one of the great masters of the early 20th century of Yoruba carvers. This is Aloe of Ise, and this one is, again, an ancestral figure, and it's a veranda post. So it's a very hot country. They would make their houses out of mud brick, but they would have a veranda, a porch that would surround the house so they could sit in the shade and do the work and other things. And so they would carve the posts of the veranda. So here you can see the notch where the rafter beam would sit, and so this would support the rafter. And as you look at this figure, at the top, it shows a warrior figure, and he has a blade, this wonderful throwing knife, and a spear, and he rides upon a donkey. Notice that his head is very large. Again, the head is the source of power. But also notice that he is supported by women, that you have these female figures that support him. Now again, women have a very powerful role in African society. They have control over the domestic domain, but they also participate in these sacred societies. And so I think that from a Western perspective, we might interpret this as a scene of subjugation, but that's not necessarily the case. Instead, what it's saying is that motherhood, the domestic roles of the family, is the thing that's being supported. The warrior is being supported by his family, and that he in turn defends the family. There are a lot of posts like this. They're very, very beautiful. Again, here we have a mother and a child carrying a water carrier on their head, and they are in turn supporting the warrior. In this case, you'll notice the warrior is actually carrying a firearm, because weapons mean power, and by this point, weapons had been introduced into Yoruba culture, and so this becomes a kind of manifestation of power as well. But there's all kinds of ancestral figures. This one is really interesting. Again, in this case, we have the ancestral figure here, who is seated, but notice that they too are supported by a female figure representing either an older or prestigious ancestor or a goddess who gives her grace to the individuals. So when we look at these things, there is a hierarchy of scale. The more important figures are larger, but the supplemental figures are also very important. They're just less important in terms of the narrative of what the story is being told. There's a high degree of stylization in the figures. There is not a high degree of naturalism. These characters are more about what they represent than actual portraits of the individuals. They're more types of ancestors. They don't go into the individualistic characteristics of the person's portrait. What's interesting, though, is that that's not always the case. So Nigeria was conquered by the British in brutal fashion. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. And that began a series of archaeology in the region in and around Ife and other locations. And this brought out a trove of objects, mostly dating from the 13th and 14th century. A series of African bronzes. Now, we say bronze, and the reason bronze is in scare quotes there is because they're not technically bronze. Bronze is a mixture of copper and tin. There's not a lot of tin in West Africa, so these are generally, they're typically more commonly called copper alloy. And the reason we call them copper alloy is because West African sculptors and bronze workers were not particular about alloys. They started with copper, and anything they would add to it to get the color, the qualities they liked, that would they do. So some of them are copper and lead, some of them are copper and zinc, some of them are copper and tin, or some of them are copper and all three. It's just whatever would work. And so these were discovered in the 1930s in Nigeria, and they were just a revelation because they had an uncompromising naturalism. Look at the work on this figure's face, how realistic it is. Look at the sensitivity of the treatment of the figure. These are all bronze cast. They are lost wax casting, which is this ancient technique. You model the figure in wax on a clay core, and then you cover it in more clay, and then you melt off the wax. This creates an empty space that you can pour the molten metal into. And it creates a perfect duplicate copy of the wax original. They really are just exquisite. And there were a variety of bust portraits, of figures, in wild variety, just incredible. Many of them, this appears to be a ruler or an oni. He has this elaborate headdress. Again, notice the sensitivity to the depiction of the planes of the face, the belly button and the abdomen. The people making these things were just master sculptors. And the striations on the face that you see here, again, that's not stylization. That's an accurate depiction of ritual scarification. The rulers of Ife, the Oni of Ife, endured an extreme form of scarification where they would create parallel rows of scars. And again, to do this, it's not a simple process. It's not just a one-off of, cutting you once. You actually have to cross-hatch thousands of little scars to get it cuts to get the scar to build up like this. It's amazing. If you could endure this, and you really truly could claim to be an elite. The most amazing of these finds came out of Ife, and they were a series of ruler heads. And again, they date from approximately the end of the 12th to the 14th century, and they were made in copper alloy and terracotta, and they are all unique. They are very clearly portraits, not stylized portraits of a type, but actual depictions of specific historical individuals with an uncompromising level of naturalism that borders on idealism. None of them are figures of old people or of diseased or deformed people. They all show this beautiful symmetry. So they're very clearly idealized portraits. And this was something that was shocking to the West when it discovered this, because their understanding of African art was that it had this, at least from the perspective of the West, this primitivistic quality, that it was highly stylized. And there was, just to be blunt, a intense belief amongst European art historians that Africans lacked the ability to create naturalistic or idealistic works of art in the Western tradition. So when you look at these beautiful heads, and they uncovered a whole series of these heads, that just shatters that misconception. And it took a while, honestly, for this to sink in art historian circles and archaeology circles. Truth is that it's just because of pure bigotry and racism. They tried everything in the world to deny that these were made by Africans. In fact, the going theory for about 10 years was, well, there must have been a traveling Portuguese monk who knew how to sculpt who got there, because we knew the Portuguese actually traded with them at this time, and he must have been the one that sculpted this. So they were willing to invent phantom Portuguese monks that were expert sculptors. But the truth is, if you know anything about Western art history and the date of these things, there wasn't a single person in the Western world who could sculpt bronze to this quality in the 12th to 14th century. That's something that wouldn't happen until much later. And so eventually people recognized the fact that these were in fact products of the Yoruba peoples themselves. But it does beg a fascinating question. Why the dramatic change? All our understanding of art from before this time period, and you can see it in the Noc Culture and others, is that art was very abstract. And of course, art from the 20th century was also very abstract. So we have this brief moment where African artists abandoned abstraction and stylization in favor of naturalism and very realistic portraiture. And the question becomes why? The best answer or best guess we have at this is that we have a very, very powerful dynasty, a historical dynasty at this time. And when you are very powerful and very rich, and you're an elite, you want people to recognize your accomplishments. You don't want people to recognize the accomplishments of the ruling class or any generic ruler. You want you to be recognized. And so this elevated the status of portraiture. They wanted to be able to remember specific individuals and not just any kind of ancestor. So you have these just really beautiful pieces. I mean, they're just jaw-dropping gorgeous. And they very much fit in with Western sensibilities, the ideas of beauty and naturalism. You'll notice that many of them have holes in them. The holes were there to attach hair so that they could look even more realistic. So they could have headdresses made out of hair. Again, you can see the beautiful striations here. I love the subtle treatment of the eyes, the corners of the mouths, all these wonderful, very, very precise anatomical details. You can see they did these in both bronze and terracotta, so we really have some remarkable examples. Now, the other thing that now causes a problem is, well, okay, if you had this very powerful reign of kings and they favored this highly individualistic art, why did it go away? And again, it seems to be that the answer is that when this dynasty passed away, that they saw more value in the abstraction. All cultures develop naturalism and abstraction, every single one, non-Western and Western alike. Western's a little weird in that we stuck with naturalism for so long, and we made it a defining characteristic of our style. But the reality is that naturalism has limitations. If you're very naturalistic, it doesn't allow for a broader interpretation. Abstraction is powerful in the sense that instead of being a ruler, it is an archetype of all rulers. And it has a more, how do I put this? It is easier to expand that to the community than something that's a highly individualized portrait in that way. So it seems that African art experimented with this high degree of naturalism, but abandoned it when this dynasty kind of collapsed in favor of a more representative kind of abstraction, one that focused more on the community rather than on the individual. But really an incredible period of African art. Which brings us to the Benin Empire. So the Benin Empire was located again in the southern parts of modern-day Nigeria. There you can see it there. It's just a little bit north of the modern-day city of Lagos. And the Benin had a very strong trading empire that existed from the 15th century all the way up to the year 1897. In 1897, we have one of the great atrocities of Western colonialism, and that is the 1897 expedition. Long story short, the Benin Empire had long traded with European powers. The Portuguese had been traveling around Africa since the 14th century. They had been traveling down to West Africa. And so they traded firearms and other things with the Benin Empire, etc., as they continued to expand. These empires had thousands of warriors, were very strong, and it was impossible for Europeans to penetrate terribly deeply into the interior of Africa, at least in the early centuries, 16th, 17th, 18th century. But in the 19th century, like any empire, the Benin Empire wanted to expand its trading base and power. England was the world power at the time, so they entered into a trading agreement. Well, this is where things go south because the British negotiated the trading agreement, but remember, Benin culture is a culture that doesn't have written records. They only have oral traditions, and so when British wrote it up, they wrote it up in English, and the people who translated the English for the Benin and the Oba really did not give the full details of the agreement. And the agreement basically said that the Benin Empire would become a protectorate of England and that England had full legal force and power in the Benin Empire. And it's guaranteed that the Oba would never sign away the sovereignty of the Benin Empire. That would just never happen. So they were tricked into a phony baloney trading deal that basically surrendered their sovereignty. When they finally became aware of it, they rejected it. And they tried to purge all of the British traders out of the country. This, of course, led to a conflict and the killing of several British traders. This gave the British Empire the pretense to then invade and destroy the Benin Empire, which they did in 1897. And it's just one of the most cynical and ugly moments of colonialism in the history of colonialism. We actually have letters between the various trading companies and operatives writing to the Bank of England saying, don't worry about the cost. These people are rich. They have ivory. They have bronze. They have gold. They have all kinds of wealth. We'll definitely recover the cost of the expedition. It's pure, nasty, exploitive imperialism of the highest order. And they came in and they essentially wiped out the kingdom. And they enslaved the Nigerians. There's no doubt about it. Now, here's where we get into an interesting wrinkle in history. Slavery was technically outlawed by the British Empire at this time, even in their colonies. But, hey, if, you're defending your country, then you're fighting against the invading power, well, then you can be made a prisoner of war. And then you can be chained up in gangs of thousands and made to build railroads and etc. But you're not a slave. You're just a prisoner of war. And I hope you can hear the air quotes in my voice. So, if you're American and any Brit, gives you crap about America having to fight, a civil war to get rid of slavery, tell them to go stick it up their limey. Anyhow, no, because they really did continue slavery. Just they used other legal means or illegal means to do it. One of the outputs of this, one of the things that was created of this, is that they looted all of the Benin shrines. So all of these great Benin shrines that had existed, all of their art and culture got removed and utterly dismantled, which is why to this day, if you wish to study Benin art, the best place to go do it is the British Museum, because that's where it is. And a lot of it got sold off and is in Western museums all over the world to this day. Now, this ultimately had a positive benefit because these bronzes were of such a level of sophistication. And again, these are bronzes in the sense that they're copper alloy. They're not really bronze. They may be made with lead or zinc or whatever. They were of such sophistication that people could no longer deny the capacity of Africans for great art. And so if there's one silver lining to come out of this very, very ugly period of colonialism, is that the status of African art was greatly elevated in the minds of Europeans, and Europeans started to collect it in great numbers. It is this that led to African art coming into the sphere of influence of the early modernists, who saw it and saw the innate power and spirituality of it and went with it. So here we have a number of Benin plaques. These are plaques made out of copper alloy. Again, lost wax casting technique. And you can see, because they have nail holes, that these plaques would be attached to the buildings and the structures. And many hundreds of these plaques were stripped off the buildings and brought to European collections. A word I forgot to mention about any of these African bronzes is that when you look at them today, they have this beautiful kind of lush brown patina, but that is a European aesthetic. The Europeans liked oiled bronzes and old bronzes. Today we deliberately patina bronze, but that was not the African aesthetic. The African aesthetic was for polished bronze. They loved things that were bright, and of course these things, are being copper alloys, would be very bright yellow. They would shine almost like brass or polished brass or gold, and they would spend a lot of effort polishing these. But when they passed into European connections, Europeans oiled them and they were done with it. So we're actually seeing them in a dim shadow. Imagine this thing just being absolutely brassy and polished. Same thing for these heads from Ife. They would have been just absolutely glisteningly like a brass bell on a fire engine. They would have been incredible. So these plaques, again, represent the Oba. They represent the divine chieftain or ruler, or they represent warriors, or they represent courtiers to the court who are coming there. Here we see the Oba. He is wearing his helmet, carrying his ceremonial sword and staff, and he is flanked on either side by two warriors that carry shields. And one of the interesting characteristics is these boys. Everywhere the Oba goes, there are young boys, and the boys carry a variety of artifacts. They will carry his stool, which is kind of an emblem of his power. We'll talk more about stools in a bit. They'll carry other artifacts, and we're not entirely certain what the role of these boys are, but they appear to be attendants to the Oba that carry the sacred artifacts of the Oba around. So we see representations of young warriors. We also see these royal attendants. What I love is, again, the heads are enlarged. There is a stylization here, but there's such dynamic energy to these figures. Also, the backgrounds have been stippled in elaborate patterns, representing textile patterns, like the kind of textiles that they would wear. This figure is carrying two swords across his middle. I love these warriors. These warriors are completely, covered. They have gorgets made out of brass rings and brass breastplates and helmets that are made out of plated and flattened wire. So these were warrior kingdoms. In fact, many of these African kingdoms had warriors that were akin to knights, like in medieval Europe, and they fought in full armor. They were not the simple primitives that people imagine them to be, also carrying ceremonial swords and shields. Here is another representation of an Oba. In this case, the Oba is standing, and the attendants, again, one carries his stool, another one carries his kind of ceremonial sword, and two warriors hold their shields up to shield him from the sun. He wears this elaborate gorget, this beaded brass necklace that is both armor and kind of status symbol, and a helmet over his head to indicate his status and his power. Beautiful. These things would have been arranged on wooden piers and columns, and according to first-hand accounts, the entire palace was covered in these bronze plaques. Some of the plaques are narrower, and they show things like the ceremonial swords. Most of them will show an Oba with his attendants, and again, we should recognize these probably as ancestral images. Here, some of the images actually show Europeans. So this is a Portuguese trader. Notice he has the funny helmet, strange hair, and a skirt, and you can see a number of them up here. These are European traders. By the 16th and 17th century, Portuguese traders were trading firearms and goods and services and all kinds of trading goods for ivory, gold, slaves, and other items that the Benin were trading with them. Down here we have a couple of these, again, incredible warriors. Just beautiful stuff. There's only a few things that show what this might have looked like in its glory. Here is a plaque, but this plaque seems to show a house, and this house has a pavilion over it, and it has two piers, two kind of door frames. And notice the door frames? the door frames have little figures on them. That's what those plaques are. So this is plaqueception. We have a plaque with little plaques represented inside of it. So all of these plaques would have covered the doors and etc. We do have a few early engravings that show the palace. So this is a Dutch engraving. A Dutch trader went there, saw it, and you can see that we have these long, low houses made up on wood, on wooden piers, and they have these tall kind of steeples almost over the main entrances. Here is a box in the shape of the Benin Palace. So again, we have this kind of tall steeple, and the whole thing would have been covered in these bright, brassy, shiny plaques. So again, by descriptions, the Palace of the Oba was one story, but up on these piers it was vast and sprawling, and every square inch of it was covered in these brass plaques, or with ivory or tropical hardwoods, all of which was very valuable and unfortunately dismantled and then later burned in the expedition of 1897. We do have some wonderful Benin ivories, though, some fantastic objects that show the skill of the carving. So the Benin are more organic, perhaps, than some of the Yoruba, but still very, very highly stylized in their figures. This is a miniature mask, and as a mask, it's not an actual mask, but it's a ritualized mask. This one representing the Queen Mother. What I love about this one is that it has a design motif, a kind of frill that goes around the outside, and you can see one of these is an elephant. Of course, elephant is a source of ivory, so a very prestigious animal. But the other figure, notice his elaborate, strange facial hair and headdress. Where have we seen that before? That is, in fact, the same as this character here. So that's a kind of interesting detail that you actually incorporate foreigners into a kind of decorative mask of the Queen Mother that kind of subject them to the Queen Mother. What are they doing here? Well, of course, trade was a major source of wealth for the Oba and the royal family in the Benin Empire, and so therefore you're going to have the symbols of wealth incorporated into your iconography. And that means you're going to have little elephants because they're the source of ivory, but you're also going to have little foreigner heads, little heads of Portuguese traders, because those are the source of your wealth. Really remarkable. One of the other great artifacts that come out of the Benin Empire at this time is going to be these ancestral shrine heads that were meant to hold carved elephant tusks. So this one is a little earlier. This one's, I think, 16th century. This one comes from a little later. But again, you can see that they represent Oba. They have the helmet again made out of plated wire, and they have this gorget made out of beads piled up around their neck. But in the head, you can see a socket, and this one has a socket too. It's just harder to see. And that socket would have held a carved elephant tusk, a full elephant tusk. And those elephant tusks are again carved with images of ancestors, but also some traders. This one has a foreign trader, a Portuguese trader down there. So these are again emblems and extensions of the wealth and the power of the Benin Empire and of the Oba. And so a shrine, this is a reconstruction of an ancestral shrine for the Benin Empire. And it is a low plinth, usually attached to a wall. That wall is under a veranda. And then you have these heads, which represent ancestors, and the heads have the carved tusks. But then you have a variety of other figures representing figures, ancestors, the Oba, etc., ceremonial swords and staffs. And notice these bells. You've got all these bells here as well as all of these wooden staffs that are back here. Now, as this has been explained to me, the way this works is you would come to the shrine, and the first thing you do is you wake up the ancestors. You have to wake up the ancestors so that they will listen to you. So you would ring the bells or the gongs to get their attention. You would then perform a sacrifice, and usually a chicken, but it could be a goat. And we do know that there was human sacrifice, not terribly often. In fact, many people postulate that that's what those boys were, is that they were attendants, but they were also the chief form of sacrifice. A lot of that is probably exaggeration. You always have to take these claims of human sacrifice with a grain of salt, because they're coming from Western sources. But we do know that human sacrifice happened. So the figure would be brought to this location, and as you can see from the stains running down the face of it, they would be sacrificed. The blood would be poured out onto the altar, which would be believed to revive the ancestral spirits. The staffs are staffs of elders, so people from the various different communities, they would come and place this there to again show that their authority was all coming from the Oba and his ancestors. Which brings us to the Ashanti Empire. So the Ashanti Empires is from one of the Akan peoples. The Akan peoples are a wide group of ethnic peoples that live in what is modern-day Ghana and the Ivory Coast. Again, not to be associated with the ancient Ghana Empire, which was different. The current Ashanti Empire was founded in 1701, and the Ashanti king, the Ashantahene, is again one of these divine chieftains. He is someone who is believed to have been granted authority from the gods or descended from the gods. Specifically, his ancestor received the Golden Stool, and the Golden Stool, which you can see here, was the source of the very famous Anglo-Ashanti Wars. So what is the Golden Stool? Well, let's talk about it. In the Ashanti culture, everyone has a stool. Everyone. The stools are usually carved from a single block of wood, and they're very unique. They're carved to match the identity of the person. And so they are often covered with attributes associated. This one has a barrel as a base, because Western trade goods would come in barrels, and so barrels were a source of wealth and prosperity to these cultures. It also has a firearm for that reason. And when there is ever a discussion or a council in your village, you will come to the council and you will bring your stool and you will sit on your stool. So stool is very much a symbol of your authority and your power. It's also a symbol of your soul, your identity. So when you actually leave, if you are to leave a council or an assembly, you never let your stool stay standing. You would actually tilt it over on its side to prevent the stool from being used by anyone else, from anyone else sitting in the stool. Because to do so would be a way of stealing your authority, your juju, your kind of mystical power of yourself, and would be a grave insult. So what people would do is they would come, they would bring their stool, and if they had to get up for a few minutes, they would tilt the stool over, or they would pick the stool up and take it with them. So the stool is very closely associated with the identity and the soul of the person. Now, what's interesting is that the stool not just represents the person, but it can represent greater ideas. And so the famous Golden Stool, the Ashanti Tui Sika Dwa, I hope I'm saying that correctly, it represents the soul of all the Ashanti people. And according to tradition, Akomfu Anokie, who was the high priest and one of the chief founders of the Ashanti peoples, had the stool descended to him from the sky. And he caused it to descend from the gods, and it landed on the lap of the first Ashanti king, Osei Tutu. And so the stool is not a throne. I want to make that very, very clear. It is not a throne, and it is not the throne of the Ashantahene. It is a stool that represents the very soul of the Ashanti people. And that is why when it is displayed, it is always on its side, because no one has a right to sit in it, because it doesn't belong to any one person. When the Ashantahene sits down, he does not sit down in the stool. The stool actually has its own throne that sits next to him, and he sits next to it. It's interesting that in this case, this throne is inspired by Western thrones, and so the stool itself is enthroned as a sacred object. Okay, well, this brings us to the War of the Golden Stool. which is one of these great stories. And Hollywood is absolutely morally and creatively bankrupt. There's so many great stories they could tell. You could make an epic movie out of the story of the Golden Stool, and no one's ever done it. It should be done. But anyhow, maybe it's better that they don't do it, because they would probably butcher it and ruin it like they ruin everything. But this was the representation of the Ashanti people. Now, the Ashanti knew full well what had happened to the Benin. They're just, the next empire over. And the Ashanti were well aware that the Europeans had guns and powers beyond what they could resist. And so the Ashanti, being very cagey, decided, okay, so we've got to make an alliance, and we've got to, find a way that we can coexist and save the majority of our culture, rather than, just being absolutely obliterated like the Benin Empire was. So they negotiated a meeting with the British representatives, and they, like in all official, kind of events, they brought out the Golden Stool and sat it upon its own throne. At that time, the British governor, out of pure Western arrogance, insisted that the stool be brought out and that he be allowed to sit on it. Now again, being a Westerner, his idea is a throne is an emblem of power, and I want to prove to these people that I have the power, that I'm the ruler here. But of course, that's not what it meant in the Ashanti tradition. It meant the very soul. So by him insisting on sitting in it, he was attempting to steal the very soul of the Ashanti people. Well, it immediately broke out into a riot. The stool was carried away to safety. Several British people were killed, and several Ashanti were killed. And thus began the Wars of the Golden Stool. And the stool became like... it came like Mel Gibson out of Braveheart. It was this legendary object that would appear from time to time in the middle of the Anglo-Ashanti Wars, inspiring and encouraging the people. And the British tried for, decades to get their hands on it, to no avail. And an amazing thing happened. The Ashanti actually successfully fought a guerrilla war against the British forces. They decided, we can't face them right on the field of battle, like we're used to, so we'll stage a guerrilla war. And so for decades, they managed to keep up this guerrilla war. That is why today the modern flag of the nation of Ghana has a golden stool on it. Eventually, the British realized that this was a losing battle for them, and they negotiated a kind of peace, and the Ashanti people allowed it. And then in 1957, the modern state of Ghana was established, and the Ashanti king, the Asantehene, operated within that. And so now it's a kind of modern Western republic, but the Ashanti king is still there, and the symbol of their country is still there. They decided to name the country after Ghana, this ancient empire, but it's still largely Ashanti in culture. And so the stool was allowed to come out. It's still not seen terribly often. I think it's been out once or twice since this photo was taken in 1995. They're still very, very protective of it, and for good reason. So what's amazing from this is that the Ashanti actually managed to preserve a great deal of their culture. It's kind of an amazing story, where usually in the story of colonialism is that the new culture comes in, the British come in. It's usually the British, but they come in, they destroy the existing culture, and the existing culture is wiped off the face of the earth. But the Ashanti actually managed to preserve their culture, and they preserved a lot of their history, and they preserved the stool. And so a lot of native African culture is still there amongst the Akan peoples. And again, a lot of this we owe to the fact that they had this very strong oral tradition. So we have these staff speakers that have these staffs and maintain this oral tradition. These are a couple of decorated staffs. This one shows two figures sharing out of a bowl. This is probably sharing the kola nut. The kola nut is a very prominent feature in their culture. If you meet in a home, even today, the kola nut is used as a kind of a way of showing status to individuals. And it gives you a heck of a buzz. Modern colas don't have kola nut in them anymore. It's kind of strange, but that's where we originally got the caffeine from. This one on the one side is possibly a representation of Anansi. Now, if you've been raised in the American school system recently, Anansi is this, or if you're familiar with Neil Gaiman's American Gods, you're probably familiar with the character of Anansi. Anansi is this storyteller figure. He is this kind of trickster storyteller figure that exists. And what's interesting is that he's strictly a character out of Akan peoples and Ashanti peoples. He does not exist all over Africa. If in fact you go over to Nigeria, they don't even, Anansi, is not a big deal. So you may ask the question, well, why is Anansi such a big deal in African American folklore and in education about African cultures? Again, remember, the Ashanti managed to preserve most of their culture. They managed to preserve most of their culture throughout this guerrilla war with the British. And so a lot of the other culture was destroyed. So when African Americans in the 1950s and 60s tried to reclaim their heritage, it was very frustrating because so much of that heritage had been destroyed. But here was Ashanti culture, and it had this fully formed, complete heritage, along with these stories of Anansi the spider and other features. And so therefore, that was one of the things that they attached themselves to. The same is true of kente cloth. Kente cloth is a narrow band weaving tradition. You have these narrow bands that are woven. You can see I was wearing in narrow bands. And then they are sewn together to create a full and complete cloth. And you can see the little red stitches. Let me see if I get a different pen color. Maybe you can see it. You can see the little red stitches there. So these are narrow bands. And these patterns represent different families, different tribes, different etc. that exist. But it's purely found amongst the Akan peoples. It's not found on any other African peoples. Yet if you go to Africa today, you could travel to Nairobi, for example, in Kenya, and you can pull up into a store and you will see kente cloth everywhere. Which is kind of problematic because the people of Kenya have absolutely no connection to the people of Ghana and Ashanti as well, which begs the question, what does it mean to be African? It's funny, if you go and talk to people of Ghana, they're kind of like, well, on one level, they're very proud to have preserved their culture, and they're very happy that unique cultural items, things like Anansi, things like kente cloth, have turned into symbols that represent Pan-African culture. They're very proud that that they have been accepted that way. But at the same time, if you're not Akan or if you're not Ashanti and you're wearing kente cloth, that's a kind of form of cultural appropriation. But if you look at it from the perspective of African Americans who had that culture taken away from them, you can understand why they kind of recreated it. And still, Africans are a kind of a mixed feeling of this. On one level, they're very proud to see their traditions elevated in African American contexts as emblems of unique African culture. But other days, it just feels like pastiche. It would be like somebody seeing somebody wear cowboy boots with a kimono. It just wouldn't work. Those two cultures clash, and they see things from all over Africa mixed and matched together with kente cloth and Ashanti customs, and it feels a little bit off. So cultural appropriation is a really interesting problem for that reason. One of the other things that really identify Ashanti culture and Akan culture is the use of gold. Gold is ubiquitous. This is that area where so much gold came from in Western Africa. And so you will see all kinds of gold. You will see golden bracelets and bangles. You'll see gold weights. These gold weights are often made of brass, but the gold weight itself is there to measure gold, and so they become a unique art form in themselves. We have these beautiful hair ornaments that are made out of fine gold wire. The Akan peoples are some of the only peoples I know that actually have a ceremony for the celebration of the accumulation of wealth. And here you see this woman that has gold dust painted on her face for this reason. Wealth, therefore, is a very important signifier in Akan cultures. It represents status, but it also goes back to the community. The idea is that they want people to achieve wealth, but once you achieve that wealth, you then become a patron of that society. So a common example is that you achieve wealth in your village, but then if there is a wedding in the village, you are the person that is there to purchase the palm wine. And so the wedding has palm wine. And so you become a patron to the village. You get elevated in status, but this wealth then benefits the community and builds the community. So it's not surprising that a lot of these Akan cultures have just elaborate jewelry. I love this one that has these two intersecting salamanders, rings. You see this quite a lot in the display of wealth everywhere you go. Well, there are a number of other cultures in West Africa that we should mention before we wrap this up. We have Dogon Art, which comes from central Mali. This stuff really became popular towards the middle of the 20th century because it fit all these Western ideas of, stylization. It seemed so dressed down and yet elegant and yet spiritual at the same time. The Dogon have a very old tradition, and this is a Dogon ancestral couple. It may relate to Dogon beliefs. Very similar to this is Sunufo Art. Sunufo Art are really known for their figures and their highly stylized masks. There was a very famous exhibition of Sunufo Art in 1961 in Paris. I think it also traveled to New York, which caused a sensation. People had never seen anything so dramatically stylized as well. This is a divination figure here. This is a brass figure that shows two twins together, and these are figures that would be placed in front of a shrine to divine the will of the ancestors or of the deities. Here is a Sunufu ceremonial mask. Again, we call this a mask, but generally these masks are worn above the head. Now here's where I strongly recommend that you go take a look at this video. I will link to this video if you're watching it on YouTube. I'll put it down in the description below, but I'll also place it on Canvas. And this is a video by Christopher Roy, who until recently was at the University of Iowa. He died just a couple years ago, very tragically, died too soon. But every summer and every year he would take a trip to West Africa and document these cultures and the use of art in this culture. So I strongly recommend you go and view this video, because this video will show you how art functions in African society. There are two scenes in here particularly that I want you to see. The first is that they are preparing for a coming of age ceremony in the Bois. This is the village of Dossi in what is modern-day Burkina Faso, this landlocked country inside West Africa. And they will actually put these divination figures in front of an ancestral shrine. The trigger warning here, they actually do sacrifice a couple chickens, so it's brief, but it is graphic. So be careful, you can skip over that if you wish. But I do want you to see him setting up the figures, divining the will of the gods and the ancestors in front of the shrine. And then the next is the preparation of masks for the actual ritual itself. That these societies maintain these masks, make new masks, repaint these masks, and the masks represent the various spirits of the culture. One of the things that's so incredible about African art is that it is a living tradition. When we talk about pre-Columbian art, there's a few echoes and survivals amongst the Maya and other things, but for the most part, pre-Columbian civilization, culture, ritual, folklore largely got wiped out after the conquest and the forced Christianization of the native peoples. Some of it exists in some places, but it's been brought into the Catholic or the Christian tradition. That's not true in Africa. In Africa, we have a never-ending continuity with the past. These people are still worshiping the old gods. They're still worshiping in the old ways. And we have this wonderful opportunity to see it firsthand here in the 21st century to give us a sense of the context of this art. So I strongly, strongly recommend you take an hour out and watch this, but watch out for the chicken scene. It is a little bit graphic. And lastly, before we leave West Africa, I want to talk about the Mali Empire. So the Mali Empire is the largest and richest of all Western African empires. In fact, it may have been the richest nation on earth in human history. It had a lot of these animistic traditions brought in, but very quickly it converted to Islam and brought in the writing traditions of Islam as well as the education of Islam. So we have a mix of native animistic belief and Islamic tradition. The most famous ruler, or Mansa, was Mansa Musa, that is Mansa Moses, who ruled from 1280 to 1337. And he was so wealthy that he captured the imaginations of even Europeans. This is the Catalan Atlas, and it shows him as a king holding a golden nugget right there. So Mansa Musa was so wealthy that when he took his Hajj, that is, he went to Mecca as part of his religious obligation being a Muslim, he bought so many souvenirs and objects, and that he dumped so much gold into the economy of Cairo that he actually depressed the monetary value. He caused inflationary collapse. It was amazing. That's how much money this society had. Ibn Battuta takes a trip to Mali, and he's absolutely shocked at the amount of gold that's available in this society. So one of the wealthiest nations on earth. We do have a few great monuments from this time. In Djenne, we have the Great Friday Mosque, which was built probably originally under the Mali Empire, but made entirely in native African architecture, made out of mud brick, with these boards, that timbers that hold it together. Again, it looks very much like other mosques. We'll talk more about mosque architecture when we get to Islamic cultures, but it's something that has to be maintained. You have a wet and a dry season in Africa, and when the wet season comes, it very much damages the architecture, so you have to rebuild it constantly. So this thing has been rebuilt and constantly rebuilt over that time period. And then we have Timbuktu, which in the 14th century was a major center of learning, again, right there at the northernmost reaches of the Niger River Delta, and it became a trading hub for all of the caravans coming south. So we still have a mosque there, and there you could see it. It's located right on the trading hub, right at the northern extent of the Niger River, connecting it to all of these other major trading hubs. And because of that, because Islam very much valued learning, it became a major center of Islamic learning. And some of the richest and oldest sources of Islamic textbooks on mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, theology are located there. This has been under threat, most notably from radical fundamentalist Islamic organizations in the area that see this as even too far for their fundamentalist tastes. And so a lot of these libraries have been destroyed, and there's a major effort by UNESCO and other interests to secure these books and to digitally copy them so that they can be preserved. So that brings us to Central Africa. Central Africa has, again, a whole nother series of vibrant traditions. We'll be looking at a few of them. One of the more common that comes out is the Kota reliquary figure. Again, they are called Kota reliquary figures because they first were encountered by Westerners amongst the Kota peoples, but as I understand it, it's not actually the Kota peoples that make them. They're actually found deeper into the interior, and they're more commonly known as the Mbulu Ngulu. And these are themselves ancestral figures. Ancestral shrines, or baskets with the remains of ancestors, would be set up, and then these figures would be set into the shrines to kind of represent or channel their energies or spirits. So they were carved out of wood and covered in copper, and they have a kind of evolution that you can see to them. It's really amazing. They represent the headdress and the head and the face, and this represents the body. And later ones would have a little bit more ornate kind of representation. But again, another form of ancestral worship. One of my favorite forms of architecture comes out of Central Africa, the Musgum architecture of the Cameroon, which is unique entirely to this tribe. They would make their villages out of cob. Cob is a mixture of plant fiber and mud, but instead of building it in mud brick, you would apply it directly into a form. And they would build these kind of interior enclosures that would have houses that would face towards the interior. This gives you protection for your animals, but also protection for you. But they have this wonderful stylized shape, and then they would have a series of elaborate patterns that were built into the mud architecture. The high conical shape pulls hot air upward out a chimney out the top, which would make them cool in the summer and in the hot weather. And then also they would be warm in the cold, cooler weather. So a wonderful kind of organic and utterly unique architecture. For a while there it was dying out, but they've quickly worked to kind of save it. There's kind of been a resurgence in organic architecture and native architecture because it's made out of cheaper materials, it's more sustainable, and it's actually more efficient. It cools better than living in a kind of cinder block house. Deep in the Congo, we also have these Nkondi nail fetish figures. These are remarkable figures made out of wood. A shaman would create this wooden figure, and then in its abdomen, you can see there is a kind of cavity. This one has been sealed up with a cowrie shell, and a spirit bundle would be placed into this that would then empower it. And this thing then becomes a figure that takes on the curses of the community. So this was used in a variety of ways. If you wished to make a pledge or an oath with someone, you would come along and you would drive a nail or a blade and you would break it off in the figure. So the figure became a kind of witness to this contract or this business or this oath that you made. Another thing was if you had the feeling that you were under a curse, you would come in and put a nail, drive it into it, break it off, and that way it would fix it to this figure. So this figure becomes kind of a witness or a binding figure or a scapegoat for anything that you wish to avoid, particularly to affix curses or negative outcomes to it. And over time, they would just become absolutely encrusted in this metal protrusions that had been hammered into it. Of course, after this had happened, you then needed a new Nkonde figure, so the shaman would remove the spirit bundle inside and then take it and place it in a new wooden carved figure that would then serve that purpose. Once it had served its purpose, it could be disposed of. It didn't have any purpose after that. And so these actually wound up on the Western art markets in pretty good numbers because to the people of the Congo that were using them, they no longer had a function. They had served their function. They now had a new Nkonde figure, so this was no longer serving its ritual purpose and could be discarded, but if some Western tourists wanted to buy it, why not? Next we move to South Africa, and there's a lot of traditions in South Africa, but again, we're only going to highlight a few here. One of the most important is the great Zimbabwe culture. Zimbabwe literally means stone house. The nation of Zimbabwe, which used to be named Rhodesia for Cecil Rhodes, when it gained its independence, it decided to take the name of this culture, again, this great stone house building culture, for the name of it, which is why Zimbabwe is named Zimbabwe. There's a whole series of large stone enclosures that are very, very sophisticated. Again, these are citadels, safe places to house yourself and your animals. You don't build something like this unless you have rival groups fighting amongst themselves. This is some serious protection. They're also very well engineered. You can see that they have narrow passages so that if you were an attacker, you have to go through a gate, you then have to turn sideways, and you now have to pass down an alleyway before you can actually get back out into the interior, which means that that's more opportunity for the defenders to kind of drop rocks, knives, dead cats, whatever they want on you. And these stone walls are standing today. They're really impressive. The main gate itself has a single stone lintel weighing several tons spanning this space. We also have some decoration and some motifs, little triangular decorations around the outside wall, and we can see that kind of mimicked in some of the figurines that we find. Here we find a figurine made out of soapstone, and it has that same kind of triangular decorative motif with a stylized bird over the top of it and a crocodile. No one really knows, is this a unified empire? Is this a unified empire with several citadels, or are these independent city-states that are warring against each other? Unfortunately, this is one of those cultures that is gone by the time we arrive at an independent oral tradition. We know that there were a number of wealthy communities that existed in South Africa. And you can see that in this beautiful object that exists here. This is the golden rhinoceros, Mpumalanga. This was from the kingdom of Mpumalanga and South Africa. And this again tells a kind of nasty story, because when this was first discovered, it was hidden because the white settlers who discovered it wanted to deny that there had been any previous native presence. But when you have these beautiful articulated golden figurines, that just kind of goes out the window. So this thing ended up being hidden in a vault below the University of Johannesburg for decades, and only really came back out to light after apartheid. So there has been some deliberate actions by Westerners to deny people their heritage. And then we have East Africa. East Africa is fascinating because its close connection to the Red Sea and to the Persian Gulf and to the Indian Ocean was a host to a lot of trading across Arabia and into Christian territories. And so you have this very powerful pre-Christian kingdom called the Kingdom of Aksum, down there from the 1st century to the 10th century, but you have them convert to Christianity in 330, and this eventually leads to the Ethiopian Empire. The Ethiopian Empire claims descent then from Solomon. They claim that the Queen of Sheba, who comes from a southern country, who goes up to visit King Solomon, was in fact from Ethiopia. And the first king, Menelik I, claimed descent from Solomon, as did Haile Selassie I, who was deposed in 1974 when there's a Marxist revolution there. And so we have a Christian empire. We don't think of Sub-Saharan Africa as being Christian, yet the largest Christian empire, one of the largest Christian empires in human history, is there in Africa. I'll never forget that I had a professor who was teaching us the Crusades, and he said at the time of the Crusades, the Byzantine Empire was the largest Christian kingdom in the world, and he said, but what was the second? And we were all guessing things like France or the Holy Roman Empire, other things, and none of that was true. It was actually Ethiopia. In fact, many people suspect that Ethiopia was the legend that started off the story of Prester John. Prester John was supposed to be this great Christian ruler that existed somewhere in the south and was going to come to the aid of Christians in their fight against Muslims. Many people doubt that the letter that was originally written was true, but many people speculate maybe that's where it comes from. So Aksum itself had a vast tradition of these huge, beautiful obelisks, again made as monuments to rulers and kings. These are the largest obelisks, standing obelisks. There's one unfinished Egyptian obelisk that would be bigger, but the largest obelisks in the world are here, freestanding obelisks are here in Aksum, larger even than, say, the obelisks of the ancient pharaohs of Egypt. Several of them have collapsed, but they have this wonderful design that kind of represent a house that has been stretched up, and you can see that they have these doorways carved into them to kind of represent this multi-tiered house, again made as monuments to kings and rulers. One of the largest of these was actually dismantled into 3 pieces and taken by the Italians. The Italians attempted to invade Ethiopia in the 1930s, never fully successfully took it, but they did cart off a few spoils of war, and they carted off one, and it stood in Rome for many decades. And amazingly, not long ago, just a few years ago, the Italian government voted to have it returned, and it was returned to Ethiopia, which was just remarkable. One of the few times that a Western power actually acknowledged the theft of a cultural artifact and restored it. So there is a wide range of Christian Ethiopian art that exists as well. There are manuscripts, there are frescoes, and of course rock-cut churches, as well as a number of decorative items. It being a Christian country, we have processional crosses. These would be used in front of liturgy, etc. So we have a wide variety of these, including these beautiful geometric designs. Ethiopian processional crosses are just very, very beautiful. These wonderful but unique geometric designs. We also have Christian manuscripts. Ethiopia is one of the few African countries that had its own script, Amharic, and they wrote down the Christian Gospels and the Bible in their own native script, and they preserved it. So the iconography here is in many ways borrowed from Byzantine or Eastern Christian traditions, but nevertheless it's very unique in that it has a more textile quality. It also clearly shows all of the figures of the Bible as being African. That when we look at these figures, we see that they are clearly African. This is the Annunciation. This is the story of the Virgin Mary receiving the Annunciation by the angel Gabriel. And they are both depicted as Africans with darker skin, darker hair. I can never find it, but I did see a Ethiopian fresco once that was really amazing, and that it told the story of the healing of the 10 lepers. So the New Testament story is Jesus heals the 10 lepers, and then they all go off, and as they go, they heal, and only one comes back to say thank you. Well, leprosy causes these white lesions on your skin. And so in this fresco, you saw Jesus, who was represented as a dark-skinned African person, healing white people because they're white, because they're leprous, and then when they're healed, they become black. So it's a really interesting way of this inversion of the story as we understand it, all reinterpreted to the new culture. So here is this beautiful, fabulous diptych. This is a kind of icon. In this case, again, we have very popular saints, but also the 12 apostles. They're looking at the Madonna, and notice everyone is African. One of my favorite places in Ethiopia, I guess favorite to study with, I've never been to Ethiopia. My grandfather actually taught in Ethiopia. Long story short, my grandpa was a chemistry and physics teacher, and he got to teach at Addis Ababa University, and he actually got to hang out with Afewerk Tekle. Afewerk Tekle was the last court painter to Haile Selassie I. And so he actually got Afewerk Tekle to paint a picture for him. And that picture is hanging on my wall. And so I walked around my grandpa's house, and he had all these artifacts from Ethiopia. And I was a dumb kid. I just assumed everybody's grandpa has artifacts from Ethiopia and Turkey and Japan and all the places that my grandfather had been. So I've never been to Ethiopia, but I do have this family connection to Ethiopia that makes me want to return. Would love to see it. Anyhow, but one of my favorite places, at least hopefully I'll get to visit, is Lake Tana. Lake Tana is on a lake at the headwaters of the Blue Nile, which is located right there. And on the islands of the lake are monasteries, and these monasteries became the royal crypts of many of the royal dynasties of Ethiopia. So they served as the tombs of Ethiopian kings. And they have this incredibly iconic shape, a kind of church architecture that doesn't exist anywhere else in the Christian world. You have these round churches, which seem to be based on native architecture, but also incorporate things that they took from Coptic and Eastern Christian churches as well. They have these large verandas, and on the inside of the verandas we have representations of saints. King Solomon are very popular, but also the Virgin Mary is popular. And then as you get to the interior of these churches, they're just lavishly covered in beautiful frescoes that blend a kind of nativist style with imports from the Byzantine Empire as well. This one has long stories about the Virgin Mary as well, so stories about King Solomon as well. Beautiful stuff, gorgeous stuff. I wish I knew more about it. And then the last tradition that we'll get to are these rock-cut churches. This is perhaps one of the most amazing traditions in all of Africa. that in Ethiopia they will cut churches right out of the living bedrock. And the rock-cut churches of Lalibela are just world famous. So these were, again, monasteries that were places where monks could go to pray and fast and be apart from the world, but they also received a great deal of royal patronage. So some of these have been rebuilt, as you can see. This one, the outer columns have been reconstructed out of blocks of granite, but this here is a single monolithic block of granite. This one is also a single monolithic block of granite. Today it has a modern covering, but you can see the ground that has been removed to create this thing. Here is one of the more famous. This is St. George, the Church of St. George. Here you can see all these Ethiopian Christian pilgrims gathered around it, and you can see how it's almost like a quarry cut down into the structure. Here it is, this freestanding granite structure. Here it is from the bottom. You have to have access to these, so they've actually carved tunnels or grooves so that you can get there. And you can see that the decoration is carved right out of the living rock. The interior of these things are also just rather remarkable. Just beautiful stone-cut churches, and they would be also covered in frescoes. There's so much more we could say about African art. There's so many other native, unique, tribal traditions. But again, only thing we can do in this course is just give you a taste of what you might have been missing. And hopefully that will enough to send you on your journey. We've just got so much more to cover. We got to move on. Next lecture, we'll be talking about the arts of Oceania, which includes Polynesia, Australia, and elsewhere. And we'll get to that next time. Thanks so much for all your patience. My voice is shot. I am going to go get some honey and lemon tea. I hardly speak anymore. Thanks for hanging with me. I'll promise to go through and edit out all the throat clearings and coughing so they're not so annoying in your headphones. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.